Well, first of all, the general changes in Dixon today are population increase. However, in my time, why I can recall probably 3 different times that the population doubled. When Dixon was incorporated in, I think it was 1868 or so, there were 1,200 people living along the railroad track. So Sylviaville moved to Dixon and incorporated with 1,200 people. So Dixon had a population of 1,200 people. When I moved to Dixon in 1937 from Sacramento, I moved to Dixon and there were 1,200 people in the time, census-wise. So 1,200 was prevalent for a long time. However, you can classify Dixon as a typical small town along a very busy railroad. And Dixon, being in its current location, had a lot of commerce going on here that was not happening in Davis, which was on the rail line. Vacaville was not on the rail line. Elmira was a small railroad stop where they took on water for steam locomotives. And so Dixon was strategically located in a unique commercial location. There were probably 5 different railroad spurs servicing the agriculture climate of Dixon. Each one of those railroad spurs catered to a large trade that was in Dixon and located in Central California, where Dixon had a lot to offer. Number one was a major sugar beet railroad spur that hauled sugar beets to sugar mills in Yolo County. There was a large railroad spur that went off into the local grain warehouse commercial operation. Of course, a railroad spur that loaded passengers up at the railroad depot, which was a major part of Dixon. Everything that came in and out came via railroad. The depot had a ticket agent. He was a live-in guy that took care of the city of Dixon's commercial railroad import, export. The grain warehouse catered to the large, expansive grain industry that was in Dixon area. Commercially, the farmers would put dry crop grain in, harvest the grain, then turn sheep in to graze on the stubble that was left over from the harvesting. So there was a large wool industry in Dixon, and that took place in the wool warehouse. And so the grain warehouse served tons and tons of sacked grain, employed several local people in the warehouse as not only warehousemen, but sack bucks who unloaded truckloads of grain by barley and wheat sacks. And they'd stack that warehouse to the roof with sack grain. Moving down the railroad spur was what we all called the mill. And that was a operation basically operated with a steam generator that rolled barley. steam-rolled barley was a great animal feed. They sold tons of it out of the mill. Moving in back down the railroad spur farther was the California Meal Alfalfa Company. Processed tons and tons of alfalfa hay. And of course at the end of that spur was the Dixon dryer, who had a dehydration drying system for drying alfalfa hay, and that was used commercially as animal feed. So then, moving on down the railroad spurs, and mind you, there was always a steam locomotive off-loading and unloading loaded and unloaded railroad cars on these different spurs. But moving on down a little farther, Armor Meat had a railroad spur that brought in cattle, trainloads of cattle, and there was cowboys always ready on a horse to unload those cattle and herd them up into corrals and help supply the animal kill at there was a Mace Meat Company then, employed probably 100 different employees in the meat processing industry. They serviced the Bay Area via meat trucks, and so it was a major operation, a major source of employment in Dixon is the Mace Meat Company. Moving on a little farther up, the Dixon Livestock Auction Yard had a large auction sale every Wednesday, and the importance of Dixon insofar as the auction yard was, the Dixon auction yard set the West Coast fat lamb price coastwise and also inland. So the fat lamb price originated from Dixon, and that was a major part of the lamb industry, setting the price for fat lambs, and of course along with the lambs and sheep went cattle in the auction yard. And so Dixon was quite well established as a living commercial railroad outlet, and I might say that with all these opportunities, the typical, I've said this before, but typical high school graduate didn't have to leave Dixon to either go to school or get a job. There were plenty of jobs in Dixon. Dixon had employment for everybody. When the highway went through Dixon, there was another commercial industry and stopovers, service stations on about every other corner. People stopping for shopping, people stopping for food and drinks, and so Dixon was a well-established stop on the freeway. But mind you, Dixon was unlike any other city. Yeah, 1,200 people, local police department. Hey, the local police department in Dixon was not geared up to run high-speed vehicles and arrest people for speeding. So they hired a professional individual as what they called a speed cop. And that guy, he was technically involved in chasing down speeders. And I can remember him as he had a Ford automobile that was hopped up a little bit, and he would get up in the morning and get situated along a local street facing the highway, and he'd work the brakes on his Ford so that he could stop. But when the brakes got hot, you could see the cop laying underneath the Ford, slacking the brakes off a little bit. But he was ready, and he was well known and well respected, because Dixon took in a lot of speeding tickets in the early days.
I see.
So other than that, why, population stayed at 1,200 for a long time, until you might call it the boom hit Dixon. People found it. We lost the railroad depot. We lost all the industry attached to the railroad. All those railroad spurs were abolished. There was no more switch engine in Dixon to load those cars onto railroad trains that went internationally, or not internationally, but nationally. Anyway, Dixon, if you want to say changed for the better, that would be a controversial subject, because Dixon doesn't have what it used to have. A poor high school kid graduating, if he doesn't go to college somewhere, I don't think he can find a job in Dixon. So progress is progress, and here we are, probably at close to way over probably 4, 5, 6, 10, 20,000 people, and more coming. So here we are at this modern day and age, saying, yeah. So I'm from Dixon, and oh, by the way, what's the industry in Dixon? Well, I'm in the real estate business. That's the hottest thing going here.
That's right.
So
That's right.
with that, why, a short, brief little rundown on Dixon. It's still got the main street, still got the core area, still got the spirit, but take it or leave it, we're in the real estate business now instead of slaughterhouse and sugar beets and wool and grain.
Yeah.
It's a for sale sign on a house now.
That's right. You know, you talked about the old highway. You know, the old highway had some restaurants that are long gone, like the Red Spot, and the Old Orange was on the original downtown Adams Street. And you talked about a restaurant out by Midway Road where the bankers went to have lunch or something.
Well, Dixon with the highway, and it was only a 2-lane highway. And yeah, we had trucks that stopped here. We had the old Normandy Cafe and Auto Court versus motel. Okay, park your car and sleep all night. Yeah, and various service stations on the core area of Dixon with the highway. Early on in those days, the automobile and the truck, they had to stop more often for check the radiator, check the oil, and all that. So Dixon geared up for all of that modern day stuff in those days. So Dixon was well prepared, and Dixon was well used as a major highway stop. That was what they called the Lincoln Highway, and I don't know why it was called the Lincoln Highway, but every 10 miles there would be a marker with Abraham Lincoln's name on it. Those became hot items, and people would steal them and put them in their yard. They had different construction companies and different phases of the freeway, and the freeway went in, but the overpasses didn't come until later. And the overpasses were a much needed thing, because you could hardly cross that freeway unless you had a lucky break in traffic. So It was tough. I was born in Sacramento, and I was raised in Oak Park, and I've got a lot of experiences there. I went to school up until the 6th grade, and then my father worked for the Bank of America, and he was transferred to Dixon. I was born in Sacramento at the Sutter Hospital and went to school at what we call the Newton Booth School, which is not in existence. And then my father knew people in Dixon, and he jumped at the opportunity while working at the Bank of America to get transferred to Dixon to be employed in the Dixon's Bank of America. Of course, Dixon was 1,200 people, like I mentioned earlier. However, I will say this, that Dixon was a pretty much country school, if I may, and coming from Sacramento was a little bit hard to transition in. You can only go so far until you're out in the country here. But I blended in and locally became a country kid. So here I am today, and I don't regret it. It was a great experience, and I'm glad for the opportunity to have lived in Dixon and being raised here. So I am thankful for that.
So you're 96 years old now.
Well, they call it 96 years old, but the proper terminology is 96 years young.
So the Farmers Exchange was a big part of your life, and Dixon, it was kind of a central place for a lot of farmers, a lot of hunters and fishermen. It was a...
Well, we had a general store called the Farmers Exchange, and the definition, and to make it more understandable, was the Farmers Exchange, we bought grain and commercially sold it. We bought wool, commercially sold it. Those were two very important parts of the entire Dixon atmosphere, because if you were a farmer and had a grain crop sitting in a warehouse, it's not going to do you any good until you sold it. So we had grain briars that we bought huge amounts of grain, shipped it on the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
The main part of Dixon's core area was the railroad, because everything either came in by rail or went out by rail. So you can understand that the railroad was very important.
Yeah. And the Farmers Exchange was kind of a gathering place too.
Well, it was owned and operated by people that were in the mainstream of Dixon's life.
Yeah.
It was a hardware, sporting goods outlet, and kind of a hub of atmosphere that went on in Dixon.
It was part of when Dixon was self-contained. You didn't have to travel out of town to buy a washer, dryer, or anything. Farmers Exchange sold everything, it seemed, you needed for your house.
Yeah, you can't buy anything like that in Dixon.
Yeah.
You can't buy a washing machine. You can't buy a new refrigerator. You can't buy a lot of stuff in here.
Yeah.
You got to leave Dixon to buy something.
Right. There's a term you've talked about, Wall Street. No, people nowadays have no idea that there was an area of Dixon referred to as Wall Street.
Well, Wall Street was a simple nickname for West B. The buildings that created Wall Street are all torn down and removed, and parking lots are there, but Dixon had two-story buildings down B Street, and that was the only street in Dixon that had that many tall buildings on both sides, and so nicknamed it Wall Street.
And there was a big dance hall up top.
Well, there was the Knights of Pythias had a two-story building, and there was a large grocery underneath it and a dance floor on top. So there was a lot of Saturday night action in Dixon, and especially on Wall Street.
Yeah, that's great. Now, of course, you were fire chief for years, for what, 28 years?
26 years.
26 years, but you were in the fire department in about 35 years.
Yeah, well, we had a volunteer fire department that was very active, and it was a large part of the community.
I know the Firehouse Philharmonics were a big part of the social life of Dixon, and you have a good story about when Bob Noren came to town as the new city manager, and he came over to meet the fire chief. Take it from there.
Yeah, well, Dixon was a growing city, and popularity was big with hiring somebody in a public eye. Popularity ran into more professionalism when Dixon became a bigger city. First off, they hired a city administrator, which is different than a city manager.
Okay.
And anyway, the city administrator arrived, and he was escorted through the police department, public works department, and he arrived at the fire department simply as getting orientated toward his responsibilities. And we had a jazz band in the fire department, and had a lot of fun with the band, and parade-wise and stuff. And so the new city administrator showed up, and he wanted to know about the fire department. Well, the thing that a lot of people in Dixon do not know about is the fact that the Dixon Fire Department is actually two different fire departments. A fire protection district, which encompasses 330 square miles of country property around Dixon. The fire district goes from the city of Davis city limits to Elmira. The Dixon Fire District requires a lot of fire protection because of 17 miles of freeway and 17 miles of railroad. All of that needed to be explained to our new city administrator. However, our old antique fire truck had our jazz band sign on it, and he kept asking about it. So I said, yeah, we got a band that we have a little fun with, and he wanted to know about when the next time we were going to play a gig. It just so happens that after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Ivy Baker Priest was the national treasurer. She resigned and came to California to run for the California state treasurer. Our fire department band was hired to play at the Woodland Fairgrounds in one of their major halls to push Ivy Baker Priest into the state treasurer. There happened to be a very popular guy that was the state treasurer, and his name was Jesse Unruh.
Right.
So our new city administrator asked me if he could tag along because he played the tenor sax. So we, sure, you know, and so we went up and set the band up, and the hall was packed full of people. It was a promotional thing for our former national treasurer, the Ivy Baker Priest. She had a great political following. So okay, we kicked off the music, and everybody started dancing and having fun, and our new city administrator was still messing around with his saxophone, trying to get the reed put in. And our band leader, Ross Hanna, asked me, he says, what the hell's that guy doing, you know? So when he got the saxophone fixed, Bob Norm brought the house down. He played that tenor sax like a highly professional musician. He did. He had a master's in music from college. From that day on, Bob Norm, our city administrator, just about took over that band and pushed us into a very much sought after music source.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was a good experience, and we went on, and incidentally, Ivy Baker Priest got elected. So,
there you go.
and that was that, yeah.
You had a lot of trips with that band to Hawaii and on cruises, and a lot of the community would go with you. It was another focal point of the community.
Yeah, we went to Hawaii 5 times. We went to Europe, traveled all over Europe with the band. We played on a Italian cruise ship while we were in Istanbul. Yeah, it was a great experience. It put Dixon on the map.
How would you describe the music?
We could play anything you wanted.
Yeah.
The popular part of the band was a swing band from the swing music era.
Sure.
We had a Hawaiian-born ex-police officer, and his wife lived born and raised in Honolulu. She could do the hula. They could sing the Hawaiian way. Well, they did everything.
Yeah.
So we could cater to any adult community and play the kind of music they wanted to hear.
Yeah. Recently, the Historical Society had a thing on the history of the dairies in Dixon.
When I was in the grammar school, I delivered to Sacramento Bee, and I had eight customers that were still with the Doyle Dairy.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, they were cow milkers, and they lived in a bunkhouse.
Uh-huh.
So the milking, that was toward the end. There was I don't know how many cows they were milking, but it was a big dairy then.
Yeah. And you also mentioned Valley Livestock was a big part of the town.
Well, that was just another part of the highway system, and yeah, that was a big part of Dixon. They hired a lot of truck drivers, and they had you could recognize a Valley Livestock truck, had a big sign, Valley Livestock, Dixon.
Yeah.
The big sign going up and down the freeway. They hauled out of Nevada and all over the country.
A lot of people might not realize that Dixon auction yard was where Walmart is now.
Yeah.
And that was there for a long time, that auction yard, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, ever since the early 30s.
Oh wow, yeah. Major operation there.
Not only major, but everything I talked about was major.
Yeah.
Starting from the sugar beet dump.
Yeah.
That was during the Mexican Bracero program.
Yeah.
The beets had to be topped, every one, and loaded onto a truck. There were probably 100 people in a field. Yeah. So I mean, you're talking about industry in Dixon, what was at one time, and what is now, is totally forgotten. Dixon is next to one of the richest pieces of agriculture property, and this was called Liberty Island, and it was a great fertile piece of soil in the bottom of the yellow bypass.
Yeah.
Every crop grown out there, mainly asparagus, and Lib Farm was a railroad junction on the Sacramento Northern, a large warehouse, 2 warehouses, one of them for a bunch of laborers that would trim the asparagus out of the field, package it up retail-wise, crate it up for sale, and load it on a boxcar, and that would be shipped to the marketplace. That employed probably 50 people. Liberty Island had a grammar school up to the 8th grade, post office, general store, a meeting hall. The general store had an extension, kind of served as a meeting hall, and all these farm labor housing. Probably, I'd say 100 or so people lived out there. That's not here anymore. It's gone. Being in the fire department, we would be out there all the time with calls, and babies being born and stuff like that. And so now it's all gone. Liberty Island that grazed all those great crops is now flooded and no longer in use. So that's a major transition. You're talking about the displacement of probably 300 people. It's gone from the face of the earth. Well, the warehouse at Lib Farm was torn down, plowed up. There's a little bit of grain storage out there now, and so that's a major part of the Solano County, bordering Yolo County, major part of the industry. It was gone, no longer even recognizable.
Near there was that radio station, the national radar, you know, that big, what do you call that?
Well, Dixon was famous for what they call the grounding of a radio transmission. You have to have a good ground and antennas to transmit overseas. We had the Voice of America, American Tel Radio Communications. U.S. Navy had a base in Dixon with a major radio station. So, and then Dixon had a labor camp full of migrant housing. All of those are gone. Probably at the peak of that, the radio stations and the Navy and the transitional labor people, you're probably talking about 1,000 people.
Yeah.
No longer here.
Yeah.
So I guess that's progress, you know.